Dear designer, I'm Jack, and it's time to talk about depth and complexity in board games. Complexity is easy enough to grasp. In board game design, I'm talking about the number, frequency, and difficulty of mental calculations your players have to perform while playing the game. Despite what some players say, high complexity isn't generally a good thing. When players need charts to determine outcomes, or constantly refer to the rulebook, or can't grasp your game the first time they play it, you probably have a complexity issue. A well-written and organized rulebook, smart components, player reference cards, and a clear, digestible theme will all help to reduce the complexity of your board game. At any level, you want to reduce two things as much as possible: mental burden on your player and slowdown of execution. Let's just say that complexity is a currency with which you buy depth. If that's the case, you want to spend as little complexity as possible, achieving as much depth as possible. When talking about depth, I'm talking about a player's access to experiential variety and their ability to make meaningful choices. If your game always feels the same, or your players always make the same choices, if your depth is never actually experienced by your players, or it's hidden behind convoluted rules, or your players don't actually make any choices, then your game lacks depth. In the game Chutes and Ladders, players spin a dial and move a piece according to an extremely simple set of rules. The complexity is actually lower than that of tic-tac-toe. Players don't make any decisions or calculations, and they just do what the dial tells them without any control over the dial itself. And despite every game being unique due to the randomness of the dial, the experience is virtually the same every time. So there is no depth. On the other end of the spectrum, let's consider role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. They aren't exactly board games, but they are the extreme definition of maximum complexity for maximum depth. At a minimum, you usually need a 300-page rulebook detailing characters and creatures, diplomacy and divination, starvation and suffocation, and much, much more. Players need a fairly intimate understanding of a wide variety of complex rules, pushing the complexity of the game about as high as you can ever expect players to deal with. The benefit, however, is an ocean of depth capable of offering experiential variety only limited by the imaginations of the players. This is why people can come back to these games every week or every month for decades. Now let's consider Monopoly and Axis and Allies. Two games with rabidly excitable fans, but which modern board gamers have mostly dismissed as boring and outdated. If you take some time to look into victory strategies and theory work behind either game, you'll find that there's a level of depth to them that most people will never experience. However, that depth is only accessible to those that can overlook the rather crippling flaws of these games, and individuals that will play these games more times than I'll even play a very good modern board game. If players can't see at least some depth to your game right away, you probably need to rethink your approach. In any modern board game that you might be designing, you have maybe one game session to snag players, and sometimes not even that. Probably the best way to inject depth into your game is to make sure that there's some degree of counterplay. Counterplay means that the player's choices can be influenced and guided by what other players are doing in the game. If your opponent fields snipers, and so you field tanks, and so they put out minefields, and so you bring in artillery, all of that is counterplay, and it usually increases replay value and the presence of meaningful choices. Elegance in game design means that you want maximum depth for minimum complexity. The more mileage you can get out of your mechanics, the better. With every mechanic and option, you should be looking for two things that we've already discussed: experiential variety and meaningful choices. By meaningful choices, I mean that the decisions and the calculations players are making throughout the game have a direct impact on the progress and the results of that game. If your decisions mostly result in the same outcome, or there's an option that's almost always clearly better than all the others, then the value of your mental calculations goes down, and in the end, the game is playing you. By experiential variety, I mean that the game is offering a variety of experiences. This could be from one game to another or from one round to another. Either way, this is where depth and replay value really come from. Odds are, if your game offers meaningful choices, it probably also offers some degree of experiential variety. An issue I have with a lot of economic and luck-based games is that a lot of times the numbers will determine a single best course of action. So a player can be left with only two options: do the appropriate calculations and then do the optimal thing, or don't do the appropriate calculations, either because they don't know what the appropriate calculations are or because it would take too long, and guess at what they should do, potentially doing a suboptimal thing. This is almost never a fun decision to make, and for individuals prone to analysis paralysis, this is where they can get held up the most. This topic is bigger than a single video could possibly tackle, but hopefully I've laid the groundwork for future videos that will dig much, much deeper. In the meantime, take a moment to look back on your favorite games with an eye for depth and complexity. Consider how they use their complexity to purchase even more depth, but even more importantly, look for where that formula breaks down, why it breaks down, and what that game does to make up for it. Special thanks for help with this video go to Doug Levandowski, designer of Gothic Doctor and Unpub, and the soon-to-be-released You're Fired. Until next time, here's wishing you all the best, Jack.